most important concepts in microeconomics is that of something called elasticity. And I'm going to spend some time talking about what that is, how we compute it, and what we can do with it. And as we'll see hopefully toward the end of this video, that what looks like only strictly a demand-side concept really has supply-side implications as well. Basically, you can refer to your book for the definition of what elasticity in general is, and that's basically the responsiveness or sensitivity of one variable in relation to the change in some other economic variable. In other words, how sensitive or responsive means how elastic it is. So that's the general definition. The one that is probably the most prominent of all the dozens of elasticity measures is something called the price elasticity of demand, represented typically by this algebraic symbol E sub D. And what elasticity is with regard to this I'll refer you back to the law of demand, which, as you remember, we already covered the law of demand, which said that if the price of a good goes up, the quantity demanded of a good goes down. And if the price of a good goes down, the quantity demanded goes up. And that is essentially the expression of the inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded, which is really the heart of the law of demand. Well, all this is really telling us is direction. Price goes up, quantity demanded goes down. Price goes down, quantity demanded goes up. What it doesn't tell us is what is the magnitude of that direction. That is, if the price goes up a little bit, does the quantity demanded fall a lot or a little? Not at all. This is what we're trying to measure with the price elasticity of demand formulation. And this is the general formula for how to arrive at it, and that is taking the percentage change, again the delta symbol representing change, in the quantity demanded of a good, divided by the percentage change in the price of that good. And notice that we put the entire expression into absolute value brackets, meaning that we don't care if the value is going to be negative. In fact, we rather believe that it is going to be negative, because if the price of a good is going up, we would expect the quantity demanded to go down. And so we're going to have some negative value divided by some positive value, which is going to give us a negative value. And on the other hand, if the price of a good is going down, we would expect, if the good obeys the law of demand, for the quantity demanded to go up. And so we have a positive value divided by a negative, which still gives us a negative value. Now we'll take the negative sign away only to help us make the determination of what exactly, how we can characterize demand. And that's really what's happening, is what is our assessment going to be of demand? Is it something that is greater than 1? Is it something that is equal to 1 or more or less equal to 1, or is it less than 1? And if this relationship, that is the responsiveness or the sensitivity of the percentage change in the quantity demanded of a good, is greater than proportional to the percentage change in price, then we end up with some value that is greater than 1, and we say here that demand is price elastic. Demand is price elastic. And notice too that I want to make clear that it's demand that is the thing that's elastic or not elastic. A lot of times people will sort of err and say, well, it's the good is elastic or the price is elastic. That's oftentimes what people sort of jump into, and it's not correct. It's demand that's elastic. And also there's a supply elasticity measure, which is very similar to this, that's in the text that I won't be covering here specifically, but it's certainly something to read about. This is really the more functional, and the one that more functional in terms of usage, and it'll come up again and again throughout this term. If it's equal to 1, we say the demand is what we call unit elastic. That is, it's proportional. The price of chicken goes up by 10%, and the quantity demanded of the percentage change in the quantity demanded of chicken falls by 10%. Negative 10% divided by 10% is 1. So we say it's proportionally elastic, and again, we get rid of the negative value. And the reason we get rid of the negative, if we left it in, everything would be negative, less than 1, which would give us a false conclusion. So if it's less than 1, we say that the good is price inelastic, or in other words, demand is insensitive to the change in the price of the good, or less sensitive, shall we say, particularly in relation to goods which are price elastic. So what is it that we end up getting here when we talk about elasticity? What is it that we're getting? If we're getting rid of the negative sign, then we're going to have some positive value. And let's say we end up with a positive value of 2.0. And what is this number? What does it represent? And we should be clear as to what this is, because I think there's often some misunderstanding of what the actual elasticity number is saying. Well, first of all, it is not a dollar figure. Sometimes students will, on occasion, present this as a dollar figure. it is not a percentage, even though it might appear like it's a percentage because maybe you've got some 2.05, for instance, and it looks like maybe you could convert that to a percentage. Well, it's not a percentage of anything, so it's not a percentage. It's not whole numbers. It's not numbers or units of anything. So that's not what it is. Instead, what it is a ratio. So it's simply a ratio, or sometimes it's called a coefficient, particularly if it's used in other applications to determine quantity sold, revenue earned, etc. So it's a ratio of one thing to another, that is the responsiveness of the demand side in terms of the quantity demanded of a good divided by the percentage change in the price of that good. And it's also got some graphic implications as well. And just to show you what some of these graphic implications look like, I'll draw a couple of demand curves which are intended really to illustrate the differences in how these demand curves appear. So I'm going to draw two demand curves. I'll just, for right now, just draw these as mostly linear. It sort of helps the eye to kind of see these things. And so I've got price and quantity on two different axes. And let me draw a demand curve here that is relatively flat, like that. The one that's relatively steep, like that. So this differs a bit from what we've seen up to now, where most of the examples in the text and most of the examples that I've presented here are mostly 45 degrees down. And what we're saying is, though, that contrary to that sort of ideal model, a lot of goods have either a very flat demand curve or a very steep demand curve. And that steepness or flatness is really an indication of the elasticity, the price elasticity. So let's just start with this flat demand curve. Let's pick an ordered pair here, P1, Q1 combination. And let's say the price of this good falls for whatever reason, and we don't really care what the reason is. So the price of the good falls now from P1 to P2. P1 to P2. Well, the good obeys the law of demand, and we would expect that as the price falls, the quantity demanded rises. But here's the thing, that there's a greater than proportional change in the quantity demanded of this good in relation to the proportional change in the change in the price of the good. And it could be seen visually by taking the width of this particular corridor, representing the change in the price of that good, and comparing it to the width of this corridor, which is much wider. So what is this really telling us here? It's telling us that if there's a greater than proportional response of quantity demanded to the change in the price of a good, and think back to that generic formula, in other words, it's greater than proportional, so it must be greater than 1. We don't have to do the math, even though we can support it with math, and we can certainly plug it in here. We know that it's going to be greater than 1, it's going to be greater than proportional, and so here we say the demand is price elastic. And we can see this visually, and the thing to know about this is, as a rule of thumb, we're talking about a flatter demand curve. A flatter demand curve. And flatter than what? Well, flatter than something that's steeper. And so, if you've got a very flat demand curve, you can almost be assured that you're talking about price-sensitive demand, that is, demand which is more than proportionally responsive to a change in price. Let's take the other example here. Let's start with a similar scenario. In fact, we can even start with the same P1 here. And let's say that we've got a fairly significant, however, price change, and the price falls from P1 to P2. And it doesn't matter what the reasons are necessarily, we just know that there's going to be a change. Well, we line up the ordered pair on this of Q1 and Q2, two ordered pairs, and we see that there's a slight change in the quantity demanded of the good. So notice what's happening here. It's a little bit different. You've got a price change which is fairly large in relation to the quantity demanded change, which doesn't change very much. So the price of a good has gone down, and for whatever reason, the demand side isn't very responsive to that. So think about what this looks like. Graphically, you can just simply see that a very small percentage change in the quantity demanded is what is the result of some very large price change, meaning that it's a less than proportional response. And so visually, we can see and we can know, without even having to do the math here, the demand is price inelastic. Demand is price inelastic. And in other words, what we're really talking about here is a steeper demand curve. Steeper than what? Well, steeper than anything which is flatter than that. And the relative degree of steepness then indicates the lesser amount of price elasticity. Once we get rid of the negative side, it's something closer to 0 than it is closer to 1 in many cases. It's certainly, the actual value is going to certainly be less than 1 without question. And then if we took these to the logical extreme here, we could say that demand curves which are perfectly flat, that is horizontal, are what we call perfectly elastic, and we'll be seeing examples of perfectly elastic demand curves when we start talking about market structure, and one particular type of market structure that is pure competition. So it's very flat, we say it's perfectly elastic, doesn't make any difference what the price is, the quantity demanded is going to be whatever the quantity demanded is. And we'll also see demand curves which are perfectly vertical, that we simply refer to as perfectly inelastic demand. That is, doesn't matter what the price is, the quantity demanded won't change, it'll be whatever the quantity demanded is. So I hope this is helpful, allowing you to get just a basic look at price elasticity of demand. And in the next segment I'm going to be talking about some of the math, how some of the calculations work, and then how we use those in everyday life. And feel free to contact me individually if this video raises questions that you'd like to discuss.